The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the Travis County Courthouse in Texas, casting long shadows on the polished wooden benches. It was a typical Monday, tense, noisy, and packed with faces ranging from hopeful to weary. Presiding over Courtroom 3C was Judge Harold Whitaker, a man whose stern demeanor and reputation for strict rulings were well known across the city. His booming voice and swift judgments had earned him both respect and criticism, depending on which side of the bench one stood. Among the shuffled papers and echoing footsteps, the clerk announced the next case. Case 4762, Angela Foster. Minor traffic violation. The defendant stepped forward, a black woman in her late 30s, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit. Her presence exuded quiet confidence, though her face betrayed a mix of frustration and resignation. She stood out from the usual defendants in Whitaker's courtroom, most of whom showed up nervously or worse, unprepared. Angela's sharp eyes scanned the room with a calm intensity, as if she were used to scrutiny. Judge Whitaker didn't lift his head immediately. He glanced at the file before him and spoke without looking up. "Miss Foster," he began, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. "You've been charged with failure to signal a lane change. Do you contest this?" Angela inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify." Whitaker cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Not a debate. Miss Foster, this is a courtroom, not a platform for excuses. Do you contest the charge or not?" There was a faint murmur from the gallery, just enough to underscore the tension. Angela's jaw tightened momentarily, but she relaxed almost as quickly. "No, Your Honor," she replied evenly. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his eyes finally meeting hers. They lingered there, assessing, searching, before he delivered his ruling. "Then I see no reason for leniency. You are fined $1,000, payable within 30 days. Next case." The gavel struck like a thunderclap, silencing even the quietest whispers in the room. Angela's calm demeanor never wavered, though a flicker of disappointment crossed her face. She thanked the judge with a polite nod and turned to leave the courtroom. As she walked past the bench, Whitaker's gaze lingered. There was something about her that unsettled him, not in the sense of guilt or defiance, but something he couldn't quite place. Still, he brushed the thought aside and moved on to the next case, his voice ringing out once more. Yet, as the courtroom continued its rhythm, something about Angela Foster lingered in the air. Like a story half told, Angela walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. The fine was steep, unnecessarily so, but her expression gave away nothing. Outside, the chatter of lawyers, defendants, and court staff hummed around her, but she moved with quiet purpose, ignoring the curious glances in her direction. The courthouse parking lot was a mix of chaos and monotony, cars pulling in, others reversing out, a bailiff shouting for someone to move their vehicle. Angela reached her car, a sleek black sedan that hinted at her professional success, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. She didn't sigh or shake her head. Instead, she simply sat there, her fingers drumming softly against the steering wheel. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitaker was already halfway through another case, his mind focused on the parade of defendants before him. Occasionally, though, his thoughts drifted back to Angela Foster. Her poise had been unsettling, not defiant, but composed in a way that suggested she wasn't just another name on a docket. He dismissed the thought each time it surfaced, chalking it up to overthinking. "Focus, Harold," he muttered under his breath, shifting his attention back to the case at hand. The hours dragged on, and by midday, the courtroom's energy had dulled into monotony. Whitaker called for a recess, retreating to his chambers to review the next set of cases. He poured himself a cup of coffee and glanced at the stack of files on his desk. Among them was a high-profile case he'd been assigned to preside over, a white-collar criminal trial involving corporate embezzlement. It was one of the most anticipated cases of the year, drawing attention from media outlets and legal professionals alike. As he skimmed through the details, there was a knock at the door. His clerk, a young man fresh out of law school, poked his head in. "Your Honor." The lead prosecutor for the Bellamy case is here. She's asked for a moment of your time." Whitaker frowned. It wasn't unusual for prosecutors to request meetings, but he preferred to keep interactions brief and strictly professional. He nodded and stood, smoothing the front of his robe. When he stepped out of his chambers, his breath caught for a moment. Standing there, clipboard in hand, was Angela Foster. She wasn't in the navy suit anymore. She wore a sharp black blazer and a pristine white blouse, the kind of attire that commanded attention without saying a word. Her nameplate badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. Angela Foster, Chief Prosecutor. Whitaker's face remained composed, but his mind raced. He realized, with a jolt of embarrassment, that he hadn't looked closely at the docket earlier that morning. He hadn't seen her credentials, hadn't even considered the possibility that the defendant in his courtroom was anything more than what her case file suggested. Angela extended her hand, her expression neutral but tinged with polite professionalism. "Good afternoon, Your Honor. I'm Angela Foster, Chief Prosecutor on the Bellamy case." Whitaker took her hand after a beat, his grip firm but hesitant. "Miss Foster," he replied, his voice carefully measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Her lips curved into a faint, polite smile. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it?" And with that, the power dynamics shifted, leaving Judge Whitaker to confront the growing unease stirring within him. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the Bellamy case began. Journalists lined the back rows, their pens poised, cameras occasionally flashing despite strict warnings. This was the trial everyone had been talking about for weeks, a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal implicating one of the city's wealthiest CEOs. The stakes were sky-high, and the spotlight was glaring. Judge Whitaker entered the courtroom with his usual stern demeanor, the sound of the gavel silencing the chatter. But as he glanced at the prosecution's table, he found his focus wavering. There sat Angela Foster, now commanding the room with the same composure she'd shown that morning, only this time with the authority of her title on full display. She was calm but deliberate as she adjusted her papers, her team whispering final notes to her before the opening arguments began. Whitaker's gaze lingered a moment longer than it should have. He felt a nagging sense of unease, not because of anything Angela had done, but because of what he had failed to do. His own actions from earlier that morning replayed in his mind. The fine, his tone, the dismissive wave of his hand. He had treated her with the same casual disregard he reserved for those he assumed were beneath him. And now, here she was, commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom, herself a force to be reckoned with. "Your Honor," the clerk prompted, breaking his train of thought. The trial was about to begin. Angela stood, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal. It's about trust and what happens when the very people we entrust with our livelihoods abuse that trust for personal gain." Her words were precise, cutting, and deliberate. She painted a vivid picture of the defendant's greed, laying out the evidence with surgical precision. The jury hung on her every word. Even the defense counsel, seasoned as they were, looked momentarily unsettled. Whitaker watched her work, his mind split between the trial and the growing realization of his own shortcomings. He'd spent years on the bench, priding himself on his impartiality. Yet he had judged Angela Foster long before she'd had a chance to speak in his courtroom. The trial continued, and as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Angela's case was airtight. Whitaker observed her intently, not just as a judge, but as a man forced to confront the cracks in his own judgment. By the time the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts, the weight of the trial and the day's events had left an indelible mark on him. Angela Foster's poise and professionalism had not just won the case but also challenged Whitaker to see beyond his assumptions. And as the courtroom emptied, her words lingered in his mind. A call to do better. For justice, he realized, was not just about verdicts and sentences, but about the people who stood before him, each with their own story, each deserving to be truly seen.